Welcome to tonight's event. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Foundation for supporting all of our programming efforts. My name is Christine Muir. I am the Community Librarian at Cary Library. I am recording this event and I will make that available on the library's YouTube channel within the next few days. I will share that link with everyone who's registered when it's ready, and you're welcome to share that with anybody else who's interested. When I share that link with you, I will also send you a survey so you can give us feedback on tonight's program and also let us know what other things you might like to see the library offer in its programming. We're running this event as a webinar on Zoom because of the high interest and the number of attendees who registered. All of you who are not panelists are muted and off camera, and you will remain so throughout the presentation. You may use the chat feature if you have a question for me, such as something with the technology or the timing or the process. If you have a question for our main presenter tonight, Gene Skolnikoff, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen so that I can keep track of the questions that are asked of him. If you would like to ask your own question verbally, you may use the raise hand button, and I will call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question. This event is part of the Science and Economics series hosted by the library for more than 2 years now. It is always my distinct pleasure and honor to work with Mr. George Burnell in bringing you these programs, which always feature fascinating local speakers on a variety of topics. If you would like to be added to that mailing list for future events, you can send me an email or put a note in chat to me. This program is also offered in partnership with Lexington's own World War II committee, which has planned a variety of events to recognize the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Before Mr. Burnell introduces our speaker tonight, I would like to recognize George Gamota, chair of the World War II committee.
Thank you, Christine. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Gamota, and as Christine said, I'm the chair of the Lexington Remembers World War II Committee, whose purpose is to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. As you may recall, September 2nd, 1945 was the official end of the World War II. And I hope when you go to the town center here in Lexington, you will see the banner proclaiming the end of the war. For a small town of some 6,000 people in the 1940s, Lexington sent over 1,460 men and women overseas to fight the aggressors and help regain freedom for people around the world. 56 of our fellow Lexingtonians made the utmost sacrifice and did not return home. The committee has been collecting information on those that served and has a database detailing their lives. Along with the database, we're developing an electronic photo album that has images of those that served and their histories. We encourage all who have additional information on World War II veterans to provide it to us so that we can share it with others. And we hope to complete the project by the end of the year. Finally, I would like to encourage you to view the collection of oral histories of men and women who lived through the war overseas and on the home front. All of these vivid stories are available on our website, Lex Media on Demand, as well as YouTube. Today's lecture is the 6th in the series we plan to have dealing with World War II. Today's lecture is different from others. It will bring to life the game-changing technology, atomic power, that brought the abrupt end of World War II in the Pacific. Let me now ask George Burnell to this virtual podium, who will introduce our speaker, MIT Professor Eugene Skolnikoff. George?
Welcome to this special program of science at Cary Library. Eugene Skolnikoff is an emeritus professor of political science from MIT, where his research and teaching focus primarily on the interaction of science and technology with international affairs. He started in electrical engineering, receiving a master's degree from MIT, but changed fields, receiving an MA in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. Subsequently, he received a PhD in political science from MIT, serving later as chair of the department and director of the Center for International Studies. He has held a variety of posts, the most relevant for this talk being on the White House staff in the Office of Special Assistant to the President for Science and Technology under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, and as senior consultant to the White House Science Office under President Carter. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Here to tell us about the Manhattan Project is my neighbor and yours, Professor Gene Skolnikoff.
Okay, hi, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming out. This is a parlous time, if I might say so, but we have a subject that's also parlous, trying to think through the development of the atomic bomb and some of the major questions about its use. There are a lot of things to say about the subject. I want to be clear that I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist. But my interest in the subject really stems from the fact that I worked with many of the atomic scientists when I was in the White House, became good friends with some of them, and have been interested in their careers and in science generally over the years. This is a subject about the atomic bomb and its development, which has received an enormous literature, as many know, and the implications of it, of course, have been world-shattering and world-changing. I want to tonight spend not too much time, I hope, on the dateline, really, of the key dates in the development of the bomb. I'm particularly interested in and more in the decision that was made to use the bomb, which seemed to me very interesting and questionable at the time and now. Even now, it keeps repeating all the time. So I'm likely, if I can manage the time, to spend more time on the second part of the talk than the first part, but we'll see how it works out. The atomic bomb story, the saga, really starts with Einstein in 1905, when he evolved what has become this incredible icon of E equals mc squared. He was not the only one working in this garden. There were other scientists around in Europe, obviously in Europe, that were very close to it or had equivalent developments, but none of them had the sense to make it as simple a statement as E equals mc squared. E, of course, is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light. What Einstein and the others were working on was the fact that energy, they had come to realize that energy and mass are the same thing, they're equivalent. And the question is, what happens when you convert one to the other? And the c squared represents the connection between very small objects and very large masses. In effect, c squared, the speed of light is 186,000 plus miles per second, rather fast. That's the upper limit. And the, excuse me, if you square that amount, you get a very large number, very huge number, and that's of course the point. If you can release the energy that's in this atomic nucleus, which is measured by the speed of light and its mass, you can get a lot of energy. The scientists realized this right away, but there was no assumption at the time that you were able to utilize in any way the energy of the nucleus. That all developed over the years. The key dates was as I've indicated, in 1938 was by the way, most of this work was being done in Germany or by German refugees from Germany. So in 1938, the Hans Strassmann experiment showed that the uranium atom could be split, and it could be split with neurons, and what was discovered by Leo Szilard and Joliot Curie from France was that if you split with neurons, you would get more neurons out than you had put in, which essentially made a chain reaction was possible. Most of it, I say, this work was done with the scientists, the physicists, and others in Germany, and the refugees in other parts of the world, including the United States. This was a close-knit community. People knew each other. They talked to each other all the time. They wrote to each other. So these developments, as they came, were quickly transmitted around the world within the physics community. It's a very different situation in many ways than today. In 1939, there was an Einstein letter with Einstein's signatures that went to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, advocating urgent work on the possibility of the bomb. It was written by 3 Hungarian refugees, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, all, as I say, from Hungary. In 1939, also, as we well know, Germany invaded Poland and the European war started. Roosevelt okayed a bomb project. I don't know to what extent he understood, but he was intrigued by it. And it gave it to the responsibility to the National Bureau of Standards, which was one of the key scientific bodies in the American government at that time. The head of the NBS, as it was called, did nothing. I don't think he thought it serious, and he wasn't interested. In 1940, scientists in England, United Kingdom, realized that a bomb, or concluded that a bomb might be possible if you could separate uranium-235 from uranium ore U-238, that U-235 was fissionable, could be separated, and could create a chain reaction. About the same time, Roosevelt created the National Defense Research Committee, the NDRC, also headed by Vannevar Bush, who was vice president of MIT. In 1941, the British scientists realized that a bomb was feasible, they're calculated, but the task to explore it would be too large for the United Kingdom. They came to the United States to try to convince America and American scientists to take up the bomb project as a reality. Again, it was given to the National Bureau of Standards, which did nothing. Meanwhile, all the German scientists were active at work. German science, even with the refugees that had left, was still the key, the senior science discipline in the world. So everybody thought that the German scientists are probably making the same calculations that they were doing, which demonstrated a bomb might be possible. Roosevelt finally created another body, a larger one, and that was put over all of the science in the federal government at that time, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and he moved Vannevar Bush up to head that body. This time, it was not put into a desk by National Bureau of Standards, but rather was given prominence and was taken up seriously. And the OSRD took up two major projects and many others, one being the bomb project and the other being the development of radar, which was done largely at MIT or centered at MIT at that time. As I say, the German scientists were seen to be ahead of everybody. Heisenberg was the senior German scientist at the time. We've heard the name many times, Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He went to see his mentor, Niels Bohr, in Copenhagen in 1941 with a conversation that Niels Bohr didn't understand. That is, Bohr couldn't understand why he was having this conversation with Heisenberg, which he interpreted to mean that Heisenberg was trying to tell him that in fact the Germans were well along towards a bomb and maybe not far from it. Turned out that Heisenberg was in charge of the German atomic bomb project, but as we'll see later, they weren't anywhere near finished and never were finished. In October of 41, Roosevelt gave the OSRD the full authority to go ahead with the bomb project, to be later run by a military service. It was appreciated what size and scale this was going to require. Of course, December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States responded by declaring war on Japan. Curiously, not on Germany. Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later, and the United States then responded. But we first responded to the Japanese attack. In December of that year, the Manhattan District was approved in the development of to develop the bomb with a large budget and much sense of urgency now, because the Germans were perceived to likely have such a lead over what we knew at the time. University, later that year, in 42, University of Chicago was given the task of developing the first reactor, which would be a novel, to put it mildly, occasion. I'll come back to that in a moment. But in any case, the Army was given, the development project was given to the Army because of the scale involved with it. There was an enormous sense of urgency by this time. Oppenheimer was then appointed to direct the Manhattan District, and he established the central laboratory for the atomic bomb project in Los Alamos. It was in December of that year, 1942, that the reactor at Chicago went critical, which was the first human-made chain reaction, as far as we knew. I think it was, in fact, the first. 1944, the war in the Pacific escalated. The war in Europe escalated. I'll try to cover the history, but the important points was that the United States was fully engaged in war, on both Europe but particularly in the Pacific, where, among other things, the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated how many casualties would involve at any attempt to dislodge the Japanese from their home islands. In 1945, jumping over a lot of land, obviously a lot of experience, in Europe, the air war which at first affected England directly, but then began to affect Germany as American planes moved more readily into Germany. Dresden was firebombed in 1945 in February. 10,000 people probably killed. Dresden had been, for some reason, not bombed by either England or the United States, and now it was destroyed. In March, Tokyo was firebombed. We figured perhaps there's 100,000 people killed by the firebombs, and many Japanese cities followed and were destroyed by firebombs. In April 25th, sorry, looked over a most important date, April 20th, when Roosevelt died. Roosevelt had been interested, followed along, supported. He died. Truman became president, and this was the first knowledge that he had of that there was an atomic bomb project. Roosevelt had not included him in any of his discussions or activities. On April 25th, that was on April 12th, in 1945, on April 25th, Truman, Stinson, Secretary of War, and Leslie Groves, the Governor General Groves, met to discuss the bombs, and the question of use of the bomb on Japan was not raised. There was an interim committee set up in May to discuss the question of the use of the bomb, and again, the use of the bomb on Japan was not discussed. The war in Europe ended in May 8th, and of course, the assumption all the time had been in the Los Alamos and the atomic project, the Manhattan District, that the bomb, when available, was being built really against German atomic bombs. And it was never really raised the question seriously until after the war in Europe ended as to whether it would be used in Japan or not. There was question, and the scientists began to get, some scientists began to mobilize the question of how the bomb would be used. The scientists at Chicago that had been sort of left beside after the reactor went critical, they weren't involved in Los Alamos, most of them, and they put together what became called the Frank report, asking that if the bomb was used, it should be used on a city, or demonstration rather, not on a city first. All through July, Japan began to realize, the military, that they were losing and losing badly. And they began to try to get the Soviet Union, which had not yet not yet entered the Pacific War. They tried to get Soviet Union to mediate the terms of surrender. So they were actually actively thinking about the possibility of surrender, even though they still had 7 million men under arms, all of whom are pledged to die for the emperor. On July 16th, the Alamogordo test of the plutonium type bomb, there are two types of atomic bomb at that time. The plutonium bomb, which was an engineered bomb and used plutonium, and just a straight uranium bomb, which worked simply by putting the adequate amount of fissionable uranium together to explode. There was never really any question but a uranium bomb would work. It was the plutonium bomb that was uncertain. And the Alamogordo test was of a plutonium bomb, and the uranium bomb, the one that was never tested, was dropped on August 6th, was dropped on Hiroshima, as we all know, and 3 days later, the plutonium type bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. So it was August 9th that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, but things moved very fast after that. The army still wanted to stay, the Japanese army wanted to live to the death and were so trained to do that, they did not want to surrender. But the emperor that finally overruled the army and agreed to surrender on August 10th, and August 16th, it actually surrendered. The peace treaty was signed in Tokyo Bay in early September. So what I'd like to do, that's really the outlines of the history, and many more details in it, and some very interesting people involved with it, of course. I want to turn now to the other question. And I guess if we put out, yes, the primary, which I see as the primary questions and justifications about use of the atomic bomb. Remember, the bomb was originally intended to use against a likely German bomb, which, by the way, never materialized. We'll mention that. But the question was, should the bomb be used against Japan? The primary justification of the bomb all along had been, and for use in Japan, was to end the war and save American lives. As many of the audience that hears this, I'm sure, will know or know of others who are on their way from the European combat on the way to Japan or the Far East to invade Japan. It looked as though an invasion of the Japanese army, of the Japanese homeland, was going to be necessary to do that. And the whole purpose of the atomic bomb project was to, even though it was to beat the Germans originally, it was also to end the war. And so it was seen at the time. And this was and is, and I think still is, the widely accepted justification that of using the bomb was to end the war and save American lives. And if you ask most people today, and you see the casual references in the press to the use of the bomb, it was to end the war, and it ended the war. So the comment says. And in fact, the casualties that were estimated, that were required to invade the home islands, and Kyushu, the first of the home islands was targeted was set to be invaded in November 1st. The casualties expected are all over the map. At the time, they talked about 35,000 casualties, dead and wounded, but almost all of the calculations later from others were that there were many more than that, maybe 1 million more. But the actual invasion was scheduled for November 1st. But the first question is whether, is that correct? Was that the justification? And is it correct as we see it today? The second question is, was that second bomb at Nagasaki necessary? Or was it wise? In fact, it was a decision that had been made earlier that we had only 2 bombs in our repertoire. A third was on its way. There were 2 were already planned to be used. The first one was used in Hiroshima. The second one was on the way by ship and was being assembled for use. It would have taken a presidential decision to stop it. It was a bureaucratic matter, if you want to look at it that way. It was scheduled to be used, and it was going to be used. Truman would have had to step in and stop it to prevent it being used at that time. In fact, the second bomb has been pilloried often as being both unnecessary and maybe more importantly, the trigger for all of the post-war strategic strategic interest in using nuclear weapons in warfare. In any case, it went ahead. 3 days later, the Japanese never really had a chance to respond. I don't think many of the Japanese even realized how different was the what the bomb had landed on Hiroshima compared to the others. The third important question, justification, arises from the question of whether the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, remember the Soviets were not in the Pacific War yet, whether that was in fact a justification for use of the bomb, or was it a case of waiting and letting the Japanese decide to surrender on their own without a bomb. Many historians, both Japanese and Americans, now believe it was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria that was the key that led the Japanese to leave the war and realize they had to surrender. The Soviets rapidly moved in Manchuria. They declared war on Japan in order to, after they had invaded. And of course, the Japanese had tried to surrender or to get the Soviets to broker a surrender. In fact, the Japanese ambassador to Moscow tried to see Molotov to get him to indicate that Molotov and the Russians should mediate with the Americans in changing the terms of surrender and getting to end the war. Molotov wouldn't see him, clearly because the Russians were already invading Manchuria. So the question of Manchuria and the question of the Soviet action was seen as, according to historians, as much more important in the Japanese decision-making than was the bomb itself. In fact, the bomb itself would look like a larger case of firebombing rather than a complete switch, as it turned out to be. In fact, many of the senior military in the United States thought at the time that Japan might well surrender without either a bomb or invasion. There's already a sense that Japanese were clearly starving. They were running out of munitions. They were running out of supplies. That a real embargo of the Japanese islands might well succeed. Excuse me. That they felt that was feasible, but that was not a view that carried the day. At the time, other elements proved more dominating. As I said, Japan was trying to get the Russians to intervene, and we knew about it because we were we were reading all of the Japanese email at the time, so that we were fully aware of the Japanese attempts to surrender, and that was part of the reason that the United States government felt that Japan was probably close to surrender, if not ready at the time. And even posed directly as whether the use of bomb or not, it was not seen in the American government as the most critical issue they faced. We had an atomic bomb. We were going to use it or could use it. There were a lot of other issues that were dominating the scene at the time. What was happening with the relations with the Soviet Union, Poland, what was happening in Western Europe, the opening up of the of the Jewish attempts to exterminate the Jews in the camps. Those are issues that were very much current in the American policymaking circles at the time. So that this question of using the bomb didn't have quite the meaning that it took on later, and I think still does today. Another major question is, was it necessary to use a bomb on the city? Truman said we could use a bomb on a city, but it had to have military meaning. Well, Hiroshima didn't have any particular meaning. And there was a serious consideration given to demonstrating an atomic bomb in some way that would convince the Japanese, excuse me, would convince the Japanese of just how damaging this and how dangerous an atomic bomb was. But a serious attempt was made by the American scientists, to design a demonstration that would convince the Japanese of what would be in store with the use of a bomb. They tried hard. I could spend time in the kind of things that weighed on the decision, but they came to the conclusion that there was no way you could hold a demonstration that wouldn't create all kinds of other problems, for example, of killing prisoners of war in Japan that would move into a drop zone, or a bomb that was dropped in the Tokyo Bay or something which didn't have anything like the effect it would have in a city. In fact, there was little debate at the time on whether or not the bomb should be used when it is ready to be used. That would have been the assumption right from the beginning of the Los Alamos and of the Manhattan district, largely because we were facing what we thought was a likelihood of a German bomb. But even when it was clear the Germans did not have a bomb, the question of use of the bomb was still something that was seriously engaged in the scientists who were working night and day in Los Alamos to bring the job to fruition. The Trinity test in New Mexico in July demonstrated they were successful, they could do it. They knew that a uranium bomb would also work, and they were going to keep on making them. And it was something that was assumed that would be used. So the case, many of the scientists were appalled later at how easily they fell into that mood of thinking that their urgency that they felt was going to result in a bomb that wasn't even necessary. Truman thought the bomb was a military weapon, like others. He wasn't interested in these esoteric discussions. To him, the bomb was a larger weapon. And he tried to convince at the Potsdam conference before bomb was used, tried to convince Stalin that we had this bomb. It was after the Alamogordo test. Stalin didn't react, partly because they had spies at Los Alamos, and so they knew pretty much what was happening and what was going on. Then there was always the question, if they didn't use the bomb, would there be repercussions if any American soldiers were lost because we had decided not to use a weapon that we had available? And would we lose what reaction there would be of American lives and American public and in the Congress to that? Another question, which I think is one that we need to ponder ourselves in a different way, if the bomb had been available 6 months earlier, would we have used it against Germany? Many Japanese in the public thought not. They thought this was, we used it in Japan because of the yellow race. It's obviously an unanswerable question. My own view is that we probably would have used it against Germany because we were so dominated towards the end of World War II by the American Air Force and their belief that you could bomb everything into submission. Matter of fact, Curtis LeMay said end the Japanese war by bombing all of Japan into submission, which he said would guarantee the war would end by September 1st. But that was his mindset then and later. Many scientists believe that we had to demonstrate how horrible the bomb was if we had any hope of getting international control of it, that it wouldn't be understood as the weapon that it was if we didn't. But of course, the other side of that coin is that the use of the weapon lead to the proliferation of weapons and the arms race that followed. That began an arms race and arms purchases, arms military, which continues to today and becomes, at one point, the United States had 7,000 nuclear weapons with no targets and conceivably available for that many weapons. We have an arms control agreement with Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, but our current administration wants to see that ended because they see that there are many other avenues of atomic warfare that would be useful for us. And we have set off in a flurry of never land debates about nuclear weapons and how they might be used and deterrence and the meaning of deterrence, the meaning of warfare, the meaning of limited warfare in a never land that, well, I shouldn't necessarily characterize that way. Anybody interested, there's a recent book by Fred Kaplan about the history of the bomb and the history more of the post-war shenanigans that went on about nuclear warfare and what often utter nonsense was perpetrated in the name of rather abstract ideas of deterrence and warfare. I suppose a final question, was it immoral to unleash a weapon of such genocidal characteristics? A weapon that actually had the power to destroy civilization. Was the firebombing of so many cities in Japan any less immoral than using the atomic bomb? But that's where we are today. I think, given a sense of my reactions of what it meant, not necessarily of detailed of each question, what it might be, I'd love to hear questions and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there are two questions in the Q&A section, which I will read to you. And while we are working through those, I will just remind people that if you do want to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A and I will read it out loud for you. Or since we have over 100 people in the program, if you want to ask your question out loud, just unmute yourself and then wait for me to call your name so that we don't speak over each other. Thank you. So the first question that was written in the Q&A is more of a statement, but you can respond to it. The emperor explicitly mentioned a terrible new weapon as part of his reason for surrendering. I don't think he mentioned the Soviet invasion.
No, he was, I can only speculate. He was responding really to the Potsdam Declaration that came out of the Potsdam meeting of all of the four powers in the Second World War, which threatened Japan with disaster if they didn't they didn't say a new weapon with disaster if they didn't surrender. He basically was accepting the Potsdam Declaration. So the fact that he didn't mention other aspects is, I don't know enough about what was going on, but at the time he certainly was facing in the War Council a Japanese army that wanted to fight to the death. He had to overcome their reluctance to surrender. And a matter of fact, after that decision, the Japanese chief of staff, the army, went home and committed harikari. It was a decision that the emperor was the only one who could have made on his own.
Thank you. The second question in here, to what extent did the ignorance about Japanese government thinking, quote unquote, the Japanese mind, so to speak, among American leaders factor into the decisions to drop atomic bombs on Westerners?
I don't think there was, well, I think it's fair to say that the resentment against Japan was very high. Pearl Harbor and the Bataan March and other Japanese atrocities were given a lot of play in the United States. So there was a strong sense that the bomb was in some sense acceptable because it balanced the scales, that it responded to the enormous sense of injury that we had suffered from, resentment that we had suffered from Japan. I still remember when I was a kid during the war, the little baseball-sized cards you'd get with gum or other things would had these lurid photographs of Japanese atrocities that you'd get, just like you get a baseball, speaker, a baseball player today. At that time, that's what you'd get with a piece of bubble gum or whatever it was. It was the sense that the Japanese were another race was very real. Roosevelt didn't have any trouble in having the Japanese put into camps in California and the West Coast. This was, I think, the anti-Japanese feeling was fairly high at the time. I think others can speak much more cogently about how the United States felt about Japan at the time, and how the Japanese felt about the United States. A lot of Japanese think, as I said, that the use of the bomb against Japan was only because we didn't like the yellow race, not because of the fact that the War of Germany was over.
Thank you. In view of the fact that the Soviet Union started its own A-bomb program and the fact that the USSR was ruled by Stalin, is it reasonable to argue that US use of the bomb ignited the nuclear arms race?
Oh yeah, well, as I think I said, that's one of the arguments about that that particularly the second bomb, which was not necessary, clearly necessary, in a sense set off the idea that it could be used as a terror weapon. That's one of the arguments against having used the bomb or having developed it altogether, but certainly having used it that it was a first step in a nuclear, not only arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, but involved a proliferation in now some 7 other countries that have the bomb, or others that some have given up the bomb that they, or any intention of developing a bomb, but nevertheless there are a strong sense in which showing that it was a usable weapon that could be argued was decisive in winning the war carried a lot of weight for others, and certainly for the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union would have done it anyway. Stalin, before his death in 1952, was clearly saw the world as us versus them, and them meaning the United States and Western Europe, and would have done everything they could, and they had spies, they had information, and they demonstrated very quickly in 1949 that they were able to develop and explode an atomic bomb.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A, so we'll go for as long as you are willing to. And I do see one raised hand, so I will get to that in just a minute. The historian Richard Frank, in his book Downfall and other more recent publications, offers documentation that the bomb made them realize that the Americans would not have had to invade Japan to win, and the Japanese had counted on the invasion to be able to inflict enough damage on the Americans to obtain a negotiated rather than unconditional surrender.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Can you repeat that?
I'm not sure if there's a question in here or if it's just comments. I didn't skim through the whole thing. So the historian Richard Frank, in his book Downfall, offers documentation that the bomb made, I think it's supposed to be them, realize that the Americans would not have to invade Japan to win. And the Japanese had counted on the invasion to be able to inflict enough damage on the Americans to obtain a negotiated rather than unconditional surrender. So expectations.
Yeah, that you could argue that. It would take a Japanese expert to know more than I do. But Dick Samuels may have the answer to that. But as I said, there were other ways in which we could have ended the war. There are other ways in which we were committed to unconditional surrender. As a matter of fact, there's a real question as to whether that was what the Japanese were really after. That's certainly what they were after when they tried to get the Soviet Union involved in negotiating and mediating the terms. And unconditional surrender meant saving the emperor. And we had unalterably committed ourselves to unconditional surrender long at the beginning of the war, and it became a source of public certainty, approval. We were going to continue to until unconditional surrender. Whether giving up on the idea of allowing the emperor to continue, in other words, moderating the terms of the unconditional surrender, whether that would have ended the war sooner with Japan, it's a real question. And I obviously don't have an answer to whether it would have made any difference. The fact is, of course, that we did allow the emperor to continue, even though we had said all along that he would be be tried for as an international outlaw and so forth. But in fact, we let him continue, and he was to be under our suzerainty in the future. So whether the demand of the unconditional surrender was wise, whether to continue it was wise, was more a public relations business than it was reality.
So the person who entered that question has also raised their hand, as one does in Zoom. And so, Walter, I am going to allow you to talk if you want to either clarify your question or ask a follow-up. I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then you would be allowed to speak directly. So,
Oh.
There we go, Walter. I just need you to unmute if you want to ask something.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
No, the rest of what I wanted to ask is that, or to say, is that Professor Frank also offered documentation that the Japanese judged the Russian invasion to be a less serious threat because they thought the Russians did not have enough sea lift capacity to get from Manchuria over to the mainland. They were willing to be defeated in Manchuria, but if the Russian army couldn't get over to the mainland quickly enough with enough force, they could continue to pursue their strategy of wanting the Americans to invade so they could inflict damage on them sufficient to get a negotiated settlement to save the emperor. So that was part of Professor Richard Frank's argument that the Russian invasion was not the major factor because the Japanese judged that the Russians didn't have enough sea lift capacity to make it an effective invasion of the homeland islands.
Well, I've never heard that before. It makes some sense that the Japanese might have realized it. I don't know whether they realized that the Soviets could only get so far. But it seems to me that to argue that they were willing to accept an invasion from the West, and in order not to have one from the East is a little bit far-fetched, but I'm not enough of a detailed, I don't have enough detailed history to say that, but to accept that kind of damage that's implied, I question, but maybe right.
Thank you.
And I'm not even sure that I don't have no idea, obviously, whether the Russians, the Soviets at the time, had the sea lift capacity to invade the islands. We did. We could have invaded, and we expected horrendous casualties if we did so.
Thank you. We have another raised hand in here. Avram, I have just given you speaking rights. So if you want to unmute yourself, you may ask your question next. Avram, I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly. There we go.
Yeah. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
So thank you for the presentation. It was quite interesting and educational. My question has to do with the voice or any voice that was raised against dropping the bomb on Japan. And if there was any voice, how strong was that voice? And was there any debate during that time pertaining dropping these two bombs?
Well, I hear the last point. Any debate about
dropping the bombs on Japan?
Oh, yeah, but I thought, yes, there was a lot of debate about it, particularly among the scientists at the time. Not so much the Los Alamos scientists, but as I said, the scientists involved in the Chicago area, which had been instrumental in getting the first chain reaction, the first operating reactor. They had a lot of time to think, and they produced and talked about whether the bomb should be used if it's available. And one of the things they said was that they came to the conclusion and wrote it up in the Frank report, Frank being the name of an American scientist, that it should not be used. It should be used as a demonstration first, rather than dropped on Japan. But at the time they did this, they were still thinking about Germany, not necessarily about Japan. But there was a lot of talk, a lot of discussion among scientists before the use as to whether, in fact, it should be used at all. But they tried hard, as I said, to find a suitable way to demonstrate it. They didn't think it was possible to demonstrate it, to demonstrate its use convincingly. And there were some who thought it absolutely essential to use the bomb in order to show later, in order to make it possible later to reach agreements about control of the bomb, and to control mainly because if you had the evidence of how incredibly destructive it was, it might be much easier to reach a conclusion. Now, remember, the bomb was not available before while Germany was still in the war. So we were only facing the question about using the bomb against Japan. In other words, the question was using the bomb at all, but the question was only about using it against Japan because the other combatant, Germany, no longer was in the war. So that's, I mean, and it's in many ways a moot point, but there certainly were voices about it. And afterwards, after it was used and after the destruction of Japan, and today, there are a lot of voices about what the cost was to the world, to the United States, of the use of that bomb on Japan.
Thank you so much, and Shana Tova.
Thank you. I am going to ask a question from the chat. We had a couple come in all at the same time, and then I do see one more raised hand. So I will come to you in a minute, Margaret. But this is kind of an interesting question from the other perspective, and it's speculative. Would any of the other major participants in World War II have acted differently if the circumstances were different, if they had the bomb and we awaited invasion?
Well, the other major participants are England and Germany. There were no other major, the French weren't major at the time, and none of the other allies were. The British were entirely with us, that they provided some of the crucial information, scientific information, the crucial impetus, in fact, that a bomb was possible and that should be proceeded with. The Germans, of course, were the possible target. I don't know, do you mean the Soviet Union at the time?
They didn't specify.
Soviet Union did not have a bomb, and there was no way. American statesmen were, many of them were unalterably opposed to letting the Russians know anything about the bomb. The Russians knew a lot because of their spies, but in any case, the feeling was at the time, at the end of the war, that superiority of military force was essential, and it would dominate the world in the future. So there was no interest in letting anybody else know anything about the bomb. And when we started the Atoms for Peace program and such things, which provided atomic and nuclear information to other countries, there was a lot of opposition in the United States that we were giving away the store, making it possible for others to develop nuclear weapons. So the whole question of proliferation is a major issue, has been all along. It is still today. What what is horrible in a different sense is how much both the Soviet Union at the time and now, and what we in the United States have done in developing nuclear weapons of all kinds, varieties, and sizes. And the current administration wants to develop many more in smaller size, so we make them easier to use. The idea that there's a natural break between the use of nuclear weapons or use of explosive weapons, which seems clear to most scientists and many others, does not seem clear to this administration and wasn't accepted by this administration. So, but I don't know what you mean by other. There were really no other participants in the development about and the Soviet Union was not a formal participant. They had spies, but it wasn't a formal participant in the development of the bomb.
Margaret raised her hand. Margaret, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. Go ahead.
You seem to mention that Truman thought of the bomb as just another weapon. I was wondering whether he had available detailed estimates of just how many people would be killed.
Well, as far as I know, they were talking about estimates of the damage that Hiroshima and Nagasaki would cause.
Yeah.
Because he did later have all kinds of estimates about what an invasion would cost and so on. I do not know if he had any estimates from within the government as to what the death or the casualty rate would be in the first uses of the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't think the horror of the weapon was really something understood or felt by almost anybody. First of all, nobody was involved except a very small number. Remember, this is a very tightly held secret development. The scientists involved began, and they saw what they saw at Trinity test in New Mexico in Alamogordo. They realized very vividly what they had done, what they had created. But most other people didn't experience it, didn't know about it. And Truman did not experience it. And he was, as I said, kept out of any knowledge about it by Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not include him in any way. And it was completely new to him. So I don't think it's unlikely that he had any serious estimates. No, there weren't any real serious estimates at the time, except presumably that it would be very destructive.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to chat. We have quite a few questions in here. We'll get through as many as we can. We have about 15 minutes left, depending on everyone's stamina. So the USS Indianapolis, which delivered the core of the bomb to Tinian, was sunk on July 29th with the loss of over 800 sailors. That feels like a biblical story about divine retribution. Was this event well publicized at the time?
Yeah, let's see, which ship are you referring to?
The Indianapolis.
The one that was carrying the Nagasaki bomb.
Yep.
That's right. It was submarine. It was destroyed on its return voyage. I don't know when the answer to that. Then there was a lot of loss of naval ships, even at that stage of the war. Presumably, the Indianapolis was a large vessel, 8,000 people. That would have received a lot of attention. I do not know whether it received adequate attention at all. The fact that it was carrying the bomb had carried the bomb that was later used on Nagasaki, I don't think anybody knew publicly.
Next question. During your time in Washington during the Cold War, what was the thinking about further use of the weapon against the Soviets, or even more generally, against anybody?
Well, it became a staple of our nuclear deterrence policy. The idea was that you build your strength, and so then you threaten any attacker with destruction if they attack. And that was what we and the Soviet Union undertook with a great vim and vigor. And we ended up with lots of nuclear weapons on each side. We have reached arms control agreements at various times. There is one that is expiring next year, early next year. And the Russians would like to, it can be extended for 5 more years. Russia, which has inherited the weapon, the treaty, has said they would like to extend it for 5 years. So far, this administration has said, well, only if we modify it to include the Chinese and we do other things. And the Russians have said, no, they want the same treaty. And so far, there's no progress. It'll depend entirely on the election on November 3rd and its outcome. If Biden is elected, I assume that he will indicate, I hope, that the treaty should be extended for the 5 years, perhaps then to negotiate something else. But if Mr. Trump is reelected, then it'll end in its natural death. And we and the Russians will be free to build as many weapons as we want. I don't think there's a great inclination to build large numbers of large weapons. There was early on, but there certainly is an inclination on the part of our administration, at least, to build small ones that can be used. And the Russians have indicated some similar ambitions. So I'm afraid so far, the gulf between nuclear and conventional weapons has been maintained. I don't have very much confidence in the future of it if the election turns out with Mr. Trump being reelected. But it's, in any case, other countries, there are still others that have weapons. India and Pakistan both have weapons, but they pretty much use them to challenge each other. You know, we had after the war, as you know, and I made some, a long-standing and battle, if you want, of deterrence and nuclear gaming with the Soviet Union. Became a more than a casual mission, more than a casual game of figuring out what the Soviets would do under certain circumstances, what we would do, what deterrence really was necessary, what deterrence meant, how you would undercut it, what would happen, who would change first, and how would you signal, all kinds of stuff. I urge you again to read Fred Kaplan's new book, which is called The Atomic Bomb, with a subtitle. He lays out a lot of this kind of thinking that went into the use of it and possible and planning for use of atomic weapons after the war and in the current scene. In fact, it's a very good and a very illuminating and very dispiriting book, if I may say so.
And that's Kaplan with a K, right?
That's right.
Yep.
MIT graduate, I might add.
Was there any voice against dropping the bombs on Japan? Was there any debate about whether or not to drop it and use it that way?
Yeah, there was the so-called scientists in Chicago were pretty much against dropping the bomb on any populated area. They thought it should be possible to have a demonstration shot. They were against using it against Japan. There may well have been, and probably were, groups of scientists that against any use against a populated area, and maybe perhaps any use at all, so as not to demonstrate that we have that a new terror weapon existed. But there were a lot of voices to that effect. Japan was our only enemy at the time, so that they were focused on Japan. But because of our history with Japan and Japan's invasion and first of all, destruction of Pearl Harbor and the damage, and then the Japanese invasion of so many of the islands, and, excuse me, sinking of ships, led us, the general public, not to be very much concerned about damage to Japan as such. I think it was more among the attitude was more among the scientists that were involved and had a feeling for what the damage would be and its ethical and moral nature.
So I don't think we're going to get through all the questions in chat, and I'll apologize in advance to everyone. I'm doing my best to try to get the ones with multiple repetitions in here. To what extent has the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki been credited for preventing another world war so far?
Another war?
Yes, another world war.
Or another world war. Well, it's everyone's judgment is as good as any other. Those two bombs and the destruction certainly were part of the fueling the concern and the intent to control nuclear weapons after the war, to reach agreement about building them and using them and under what circumstances, and to prevent proliferation. So in many ways, they certainly were factors in leading countries to want to avoid further nuclear war and to build up the weapons and their military, so to make war less likely. Deterrence, so-called. So it's clear that those two bombs and those two cities became images of what could happen if things got out of control. And they did lead in that sense to spur and to fuel the sense of the need for arms control. We have several organizations in the United States right now, the Arms Control Society and others that are based on the idea of controlling arms, but really of controlling nuclear weapons. So those cities were instrumental. Now, whether that would have been true without their suffering the damage they did is another issue. And as I say, there's a body of opinion that believes that it was necessary to show how horrible the bomb was to make this kind of post-war international control possible.
So I think this will be the last question. The long-term effects.
If my voice holds out.
I've been watching your glass of water, so I think this is our last question. The long-term effects of radiation poisoning are devastating for survivors. Had any studies been done to look at that while the bombs were being developed?
Well, excuse me. Certainly there are a lot of studies about radiation damage from the bombs, but I didn't hear the second part of the question.
While the bombs were being developed, were they looking at the effects of the radiation poisoning?
Oh,
for
yeah, they
survivors?
were. Yeah, well, if you mean were they wondering what the effects would be of dropping the bomb and if radiation effects by implication? They were very concerned with the radiation of the bomb. from the bomb explosion. There were the Trinity shot in New Mexico, in Alamogordo. There were all kinds of precautions taken to shield the people watching the explosion from the radiation that they were sure would follow. And a lot of the radiation continued for quite a while. If any of you have not or are able to visit the site of the Trinity explosion in Alamogordo, I urge you to do so. It's a very moving site, essentially exactly as it was at the time of the shot. It's the area where it was exploded is cordoned off, but you get a sense very clearly and very quickly of what the setting was like and what the horror of it and drama of it was in fact. But they were very concerned about radiation, and they built all kinds of fortifications, in effect, for observers to sit there and to watch. So they knew about the radiation effects. And in fact, and the people that watched had to wear these special goggles so that the radiation wouldn't hurt their eyes. But this is whether they had done any advanced calculations of radiation damage in Hiroshima or in Nagasaki, I don't know and seriously doubt.
Thank you very much. I have brought back George Burnell and George Gamota so that they may give you some final words. But on behalf of the library, I would like to say thank you so much to you, Jean, for being here with us tonight. And I would like to thank everybody who attended our program. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions or asked them live. I apologize, we couldn't get to everyone. Maybe there's a need for a second program on this in a different format. But I would just like to extend my thanks to everyone who participated. And George, if you would like to say anything, please feel free.
George, go ahead.
I would like to thank Cary Library for hosting these presentations that we have been able to arrange, and to thank Gene for giving us his time and his effort. It's always a bit of effort to put this material together for a presentation, and very, very proud of the election residents who have such exceptional talent and experience, who are willing to share it with us. And I thank you for being part of our series.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it.
Well, and I also, on behalf of our program of Lexington Remembers World War II, want to thank you, because this is a very important topic that we are going to be discussing. And our next topic is actually going to be the Holocaust, the two things that are, I think, very significant legacies of World War II. So I really appreciate tonight's talk, and kind of reflect upon what you said. One kind of question I guess I can ask is, Truman, you said, was considered this as a weapon, but yet he was hesitant to use it when MacArthur wanted to kind of end the Korean War. And why was there the hesitation?
I don't know if MacArthur hesitated. He probably didn't.
MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons, sure. And Truman said no.
Well, because we were even then pretty much more sensible than MacArthur. This was first of all, the weapon would not have solved that situation. But leaving that aside, they were well aware that what that would set off in terms of arms internationally. There's not there's a strong aversion, even then, even by that early date, relatively early date, strong aversion to use of nuclear weapons. We're losing that now, at least under the current administration.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate your participation, and hopefully we can answer, you can answer all the questions that are on the chat room and the Q&A. Thank you very much.
And I just wanted to let everyone know, I did put a link in the chat that will take you to a list of the other events being sponsored by the World War II Committee. So if you're interested in this topic and the Holocaust and others that are relevant to that time period, feel free to take a look at that link. I can also include that in the follow-up email that I'll be sending out within a few days, which will include a link to the recording of this program as well. So thank you again to everyone. Have a wonderful night, and I hope we see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.